Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that His presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. Well, we are right in the middle of the Gospel of Mark chapter 8, and we're looking at a very unique miracle. In fact, there's really no other miracle quite like it. And it's a hinge miracle in the Gospel of Mark. From this miracle on, Jesus' teaching is going to go deeper, and he is going to be on mission, not just announcing that the kingdom of God is at hand, but actually moving towards the fulfillment of that mission. But more on that later in episodes to come. Our passage is Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." And so there's a few things that we need to look at here. First of all, remember our context, that Jesus has been very frustrated with the disciples. They haven't understood what he was telling them in terms of beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. They're thinking they don't have enough bread. And Jesus reminds them of the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. And Jesus says, do you still not get it? Do you still not understand? Do you still not see? And so this is right on top of when Jesus sighed over the Pharisees and their lack of belief, or their refusal to believe. And so we have this disbelief of the Pharisees. We have the disciples still not getting it, still not seeing who Jesus is. And we have the miracle of Jesus healing a blind man. And this is the first time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus heals a blind man. Now, this is unique, especially when Jesus asks him, "Do you see anything yet?" And he says, "I see blurry. I see people, but they look like trees walking around." In no other miracle does Jesus ask such a question. Jesus doesn't say, "Are your legs strong yet? How are you doing walking around? Do you hear anything?" Jesus never asks a question like this when he does a miracle. And so this is absolutely unique for Jesus to ask on the other side of touching the man, "Do you see anything?" And then we're a little shocked that he doesn't see clearly. And Jesus has to touch the man a second time, and the second time the man sees absolutely clearly. So that's really unusual. Second thing that I want to call attention to is where this miracle takes place. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and then Jesus led the blind man outside the village. You talk about a trust walk. Jesus leading you, and he leads him outside of the village. And then after Jesus heals him, and remember it took twice, after Jesus heals him, Jesus tells him, don't even go back into the village. Go home, but don't go back into the village. And so we're kind of wondering, okay, what's up with that Jesus is telling him, don't go back into the village. He took him outside of the village to heal him, and then he'll send him home, but don't go back into the village. And so that's kind of interesting. And so I don't know everything to do with these things. I think we're going to find that they're pretty significant in terms of moving forward in the Gospel of Mark. But for today, really just a couple of thoughts. So one, don't go back into the village. I wonder if it's because the village wouldn't really accept that now he was healed and now he was seeing clearly. The people would still kind of dismiss him as either not seeing well or dismiss him as, you must have been faking it all along. I don't know. I also wonder if he's not supposed to go back into the village because somehow the village would corrupt his vision. That somehow the village would cloud what Jesus just made clear. But there's got to be a reason why Jesus doesn't want this healed man who now sees clearly to go back into the village. And it makes me wonder, okay, when Jesus gives us clear sight, do we go back into places that kind of fog our sight, blur our sight, distort our sight, so that Jesus enabled us to see clearly, but the villages that we belong to, they mess up our vision so that we don't see clearly. And so Jesus is saying, don't go back to that place. Don't go back to the village. They will distort your vision that I just gave you. So I'm kind of wondering about that. The second thing, and this is incredibly good news, Jesus healed the guy completely. It was a process for sure. The first time, do you see anything? Well, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Jesus doesn't say, okay, you're on your own from here on out. I did my part. Now you do your part. No. Jesus touched him again and brought him to clear sight. And that is just wonderful news that Jesus does not leave us with blurry vision, doesn't leave us with partial vision. Jesus doesn't leave us kind of partially cured. Jesus goes ahead and heals him completely. And I know somebody's probably thinking, well, maybe he didn't have enough faith, and that's why he didn't see clearly at the start. Well, I mean, I don't know. If he had enough faith to see blurry after not seeing at all, and his friends had the faith to bring him to Jesus, and I don't know how much his faith grew between, touch 1 and touch 2. So I don't even want to go down that path right now. What I do want to call attention to is the faithfulness of Jesus to bring cure. Jesus wasn't content to leave the man seeing blurry. Jesus touched him again so that he could see clearly. And I'm convinced that Jesus is at work in your life and in my life to bring us to the place where we see clearly. We see clearly who he is. We see clearly what it means to follow him. We see clearly to be able to follow him. And Jesus gives this miracle of seeing and seeing clearly. God bless wherever you find yourself scattered today. If there's a village that Jesus has told you not to go back into, don't go back into that village. And most of all, have confidence that Jesus will enable us to see clearly so that we can follow well. God bless. Have a great day.